Shouts out to War Thunder for sponsoring this video. With League's roster currently having 170 champions and even more on the way, most anyone who's spent a good number of hours on the Rift has eventually come across a champion whose character design, lore, or abilities really speak to them. But in reality, this single champion that we fall in love with is really the result of several failed champions that for one reason or another just never made the cut. Be it due to a design being too advanced for the client to handle, or in some cases being just too overpowered to put into the game, these are 20 champions who for one reason or another had a real chance of existing in League today, but were never added. So I thought it would be a cool idea to visit some of these scrapped concepts and see what League could have looked like had things gone differently way back when. Since this video will kind of go in order from the cancelled champions that we know a little bit about all the way up to the ones where we know their entire scrapped kit and even have some of their voice lines, let's quickly run through a list of various champion designs that would eventually be reworked into whole different identities or just thrown out the window, starting first with this design for a champion named CC. As if her mockup wasn't already clear enough, CC was designed to be a defensive champion from Piltover who would use her Hextech weapon to shield allies while having a sarcastic, energetic attitude, kind of like a supported version of Vi. Though her kit has never been released publicly, we do know that her identity of a shield-based champion was eventually changed into the Poro protecting Freljordian, who we all love today as Braum, since according to League's champion design team, her ready-to-fight personality felt a bit out of place for a champion who's designed to be a defensive support. And while CC's initial design looks nothing like Braum does nowadays, the same cannot be said about the design for one of the game's earliest proposed champions called the Iron Engineer, who looks shockingly similar to a certain supportive Steam Golem. Especially with one of these champion mockups having a giant grabby claw at his disposal, we can tell that the Iron Engineer served as an early champion idea for the much more defined character that we know today as Blitzcrank, who, if I were to guess, ended up being a combination between these two sketches due to his rounded body and all too familiar hook for an arm. But probably one of my favorite scrap champion concepts was this early idea of a Viking Eagle Rider who looks really sick, and eventually had his concept split into two very different champions since the idea of a buff Viking working alongside a pet bird once again felt a bit contradictory to the design team. The jacked Freljordian appearance of the Eagle Rider would eventually take the form of the equally ripped and bearded Olaf, while the idea of an archer who works with a pet bird would of course be transformed into Quinn and her eagle named Valor, where they swapped out this concept's traditional bow for a crossbow. And on the topic of ranged attackers, when it comes to adding members to the marksman role, Riot has since released this design idea for a robotic cyborg cowboy. Mounted with a giant sniper as well as rocking a fire cowboy hat, this champion concept at first may look like it has some resemblance to Caitlyn, or maybe even in some designs a bit like Arcane Civica with its scrappy Zon-like arm. But in fact, this long-range champion would instead be introduced into the game as arguably the best designed character in the game's history, Jhin. So if you've ever wondered why Jin's first skin was a high noon one, well, I think you probably see where they got this initial idea from. And while every brief concept that we've mentioned previously has been confirmed to have been reworked into a champion that we're familiar with today, these two scrap champion concepts still remain a mystery, with Avasha maybe being turned into some sort of early version of Aatrox, and Tiki maybe being turned into Totemic Maokai. I honestly don't really know, so if you have any guesses, feel free to share your thoughts in the comments below. So before we dive into the much more fleshed out creations of champions that actually have some incredibly broken abilities, I'm stoked to finally have my first ever sponsor, which is the massive hit game War Thunder, the most in-depth vehicle combat game ever created that is free for anyone to play on PC, PlayStation, Xbox, and on mobile too. You don't need any fancy hardware or anything like that to command over 2,500 tanks, planes, and helicopters from 10 major nations, as using just the device that you're watching this video on right now, you too can command biplanes and armored cars from the 1920s all the way up to the fighter jets and tanks that are being used today, alongside a massive community of over 70 million players worldwide. And this game is the real deal when it comes to combat, having one of the most detailed vehicle damage models in all of gaming, where every little component matters, making it crucial to target areas such as engines or fuel tanks with weapons that act exactly how they do in the real world. Like, the level of detail is wild, with hyper-realistic graphics, intricately designed vehicles, and incredible sound design that really immerses you in the intensity of combat while controlling the most powerful war machines of our time, all while rocking your own look with the game's in-depth customization systems, which are of course one of my favorite parts about the game's detailing. I mean, who doesn't want to literally blow up their opponents while rocking a fresh fit? So if you want to roll up to the unmatched PvP battle experience that War Thunder offers in a clean look, while also scoring some sweet week-long boosts to get yourself started, you'll want to check out the first links in the description below, which for a limited time will score you a massive bonus pack of premium skins, exclusive Eagle of Valor decoration, 100,000 Silver Lions, 7 days of premium accounts, and even more, all for free on either PC or console if it's your first time playing or if you're coming back after at least 6 months away. It's truly an unmatched experience if you haven't given it a shot already. It costs nothing to download, and it's just the undisputed best game out there if you're a fan of military history. But now, to kind of bridge the gap between champions that weren't anything more than initial concepts into talking about cancelled champions that had basically all their abilities ready to go, let's first take a moment to talk about the design of a champion known as Husk. Despite being eventually taken apart to make two of League's more popular solo queue carries in Camille and Kai'Sa, Husk actually had some pretty interesting lore to go with her design, as she was supposed to be Caitlyn's ex-partner who defected from Zaun to Piltover after Caitlyn had paralyzed her from the waist down in a shootout of betrayal, which would have been a crazy character arc. After defecting to Zaun, Husk would eventually become the leader of a band of outlaws and mercenaries known as the Hive, being armed with a baton and stinger weapon to enforce Zaunite progress by means of force above all else, and we can see some pretty clear similarities between her design and what would eventually become both Kai'Sa and Camille's. Though Kai'Sa would eventually be released as the Daughter of the Void as opposed to an outlaw from Zaun, both her and Husk utilized twin jets for their respective movement during fast-paced combat, while Camille would embody many parts of Husk's personality and lore as well, as she too is from Piltover and does not use her own legs while fighting, instead valuing progress so much that she replaced them with blades through Hextech augmentations. And though Husk and Camille share a very clear resemblance to one another in both their background and character, even more obvious similarities can be seen between Elise and what was supposed to be one of League's original 40 champions, a character named Priscilla, the Spider Queen, who not only had her character model found in the game files, but even descriptions of some of her abilities as well. Her passive camouflage increased her mana regeneration based on her level, and her Q functioned very similarly to how Elise's web does today. But instead of just rooting the enemy, the target caught in the web would actually be drawn back towards Priscilla, dealing further damage and allowing her to use what are basically two additional passives in her W and E as well. With her W, Inject Spiderlings, Priscilla would passively stack slowness on targets hit by her auto attacks, with this number of stacks spawning an equal number of Spiderlings from the target's body if they were killed. Priscilla's E granted additional lifesteal based on how many times it was upgraded, which was especially effective when combined with her ultimate Corpse Maker, where for 2.75 seconds, the Spider Queen would pin down her target and slash at them with her front claws, sort of like Warwick's ult, but as a spider. After she was initially scrapped for the game's beta launch, while originally going by the name of Nidalee, Riot Zilius posted on League's old forums that a Spider Queen champion would be added only if the community really wanted it. And in a community-run poll, the support for a Spider champion won in a landslide, with Priscilla's concept of course being remade to the champion we now know today as Elise, and her character model design funnily enough inspiring old pre-rework Urgot. But as you may have expected, there are still a few other champions that were data mined from League's original scrapped roster, including a voodoo shaman named Taboo. Being a support champion who wielded his magical knowledge to boost allies, Taboo's backstory was that he was one of the few remaining voodoo shamans of the Jugos culture, who traveled around with gypsies to sell his wares of shrunken heads, shriveled body parts, and encapsulated human souls. You know, just typical shaman or witchcrafty stuff. As for his abilities, Taboo was a ranged support that passively made enemies around him deal a flat 15% less damage to his allies, with his Q Tattoo also being an interesting concept that we can see in the form of both item and arena augments even today, since it linked Taboo to either a target ally or enemy and made it so that if he was linked to an ally, Taboo and the linked champion would share their healing, and if he was linked to an enemy, Taboo would share a part of any of the damage he took with said enemy. His W, Circle of Ancestors, was essentially like a smaller version of Redemption in that it healed allies while damaging enemies, while his E, Pacify, suppressed a target for anywhere between 4 to 6 seconds, which is just so insanely broken to have on a basic ability with only a 10-second cooldown. As for his ultimate, Taboo would tether himself to a target and deal damage to them over a period of time while healing for the same amount, kind of like a tethered Trundle R, and though he would never be released officially into the game in this current state, outside of being a potential inspiration for pre-rework Swain, he did technically appear on the Rift's Harrowing map inside a coffin, along with 2 even more developed champions that we'll get to a bit later. But as for now, let's talk briefly about what is probably one of the most creative concepts that Riot has ever come up with that wasn't released into the game in its originally designed state. A champion that was revealed on an old episode of the Beyond the Rift podcast that was simply known as the Ink Mage. Now, yes, we do have an Ink Mage nowadays in the form of one of the game's more recent releases, Hwei. However, this unreleased champion's concept was probably even cooler than what we have nowadays, even if it makes sense why they didn't end up releasing it. Essentially, instead of casting abilities like you would on every other champion, this Ink Mage would instead draw out their abilities using the mouse's cursor on the screen, either as a way to fire projectiles or potentially draw their own terrain. And from my understanding and doing some research on this champion, this is actually something that was successfully done in the champion's early demo. Though not much more has been revealed about what their abilities may have been outside of just speculation, the official reason for why this champion concept was scrapped was due to the fact that it was simply too overwhelming for players to have clear control over. Or for those who are familiar with the Broken by Concept podcast, it could also be described as adding too much to players' mental stacks. Especially if this unnamed Ink Mage ended up being a mid laner or an ADC, the amount of actions required per minute to play League simply made this champion too stressful to use, as while it may be a cool thing to sit and do in practice tool, accurately drawing with your cursor while trying to properly position in a chaotic team fight became much more challenging to play without feeling massively overwhelmed. But hey, this could be a cool ultimate or something where a player channels for a few seconds and can draw damaging abilities on the map during this time. Or if you have any other better ideas, please let me know in the comments, as I'm sure we're all perfectly qualified champion and gameplay designers here. And while we've already talked about parts of cancelled champions who've inspired 1 or maybe 2 champions that we know of today, when it comes to the undead fisherman named Marduk, it's possible that some of the abilities of 3 different champions all came from his one kit, being another scrap design that was revealed during the showcasing of a former Rioter's portfolio of artwork. Also being potentially one of the original 40 champions that were designed for League's release, Marduk, the Fisher of Souls, was originally an archaeologist named Dr. Mark Strauss that found himself corrupted by the dark materials he was studying during a cave exhibition, eventually going mad and turning into a grim, twisted skeletal creature who eventually left these caverns in search of even more souls to feast upon, bringing both his archaeology and fishing supplies on his quests. With this creepily cool champion concept in mind, from what we're able to piece together in his initial development, Marduk had an interesting combination of abilities from Rengar, Thresh, and Fizz, being primarily a utility champion who would play around his capturing capabilities. His early designs involved a net toss that resembles what we now know today as Rengar's Bola Strike, as well as both a hook and the ability to collect souls, things that of course resemble two of Thresh's most recognizable characteristics. But where things get especially interesting is his ability that did the exact same thing as Fizz's ultimate while also being called Chum the Waters, which if you didn't already know is the exact same name of Fizz's R. Naturally, with such an interesting character design, it shouldn't come as a surprise that Marduk was more or less scrapped for parts after being unable to find a clear direction. Something that unfortunately was definitely not the case for what I can only describe as kind of a meme of a champion in Rob Blackblade, the Adventurer. Being a champion that was shortly cancelled after League's beta phase, according to Riot Ezreal, no part of Rob's kit was deemed worthy of keeping due to how out of place and uninspiring it was. However, unlike the rest of the champions featured in this list, not only did Rob have abilities, but also a few recorded voice lines as well that have still survived even to this very day. Though the details of his passive have never been fully revealed, Rob's kit primarily revolved around a melee crit chance playstyle, with his Q even throwing a knife that could critically strike for triple its regular damage, perhaps kind of like pre-rework Shen's 4-pull blade throw. As for Rob's W, he would play to his role as a melee slayer heavily by having the ability to be completely stealth while gaining movement speed, which comboed nicely with his Vital Blow E that would either stun or sleep the target of the attack based on whether Rob was stealthed or not, and this form of sleeping CC was actually something not used until Zoe's release in late 2017. While at first appearing like it's just a basic line of text, Rob's ultimate was actually pretty strong, granting him anywhere between 5 to 11 seconds of only critical strikes on enemies based on level. But with that said, I think the biggest standout of its kit is some of his incredibly memeable voice lines, and here's a couple of them for those who are curious as to what he sounded like.
Stuffed and mounted, you'll look good hanging in my den. Righto! Ha 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 ha! Look out, Rhino! Oh wait, you're just very ugly.
Now, to transition from perhaps the goofiest champion on this list into possibly the scariest, we have this terrifying void-like creature known as Omen, who was in development for a pretty decent amount of time before ultimately spurring the champion design team to design both Riven and Graves due to the designers not knowing if Omen should be ranged or melee. They liked the idea of a quadruped monster roaming around Summoner's Rift, but as we can tell by his varied designs across his development, the design team couldn't figure out if Omen would attack by shooting out spines, be a beefy tank walking on all fours, or if he'd play more into his demonic appearance by being a stealthy assassin. And despite multiple kits and roles being tested on him, nothing seemed to match all of his pieces into place due to one part of his kit or appearance coming into conflict with another, no matter which way the team turned. However, despite going through multiple iterations of scrapped abilities, we do know about at least one of them that was presumably made during his time in development as a ranged champion, being described as like a gangplank ult, but with a shorter range and need to be channeled instead of being a point-and-click cast. On top of that, there was even an idea to shrink down Omen's design and make him into a creature that would be spawned from a larger source, which now that I think about it seems a bit like how Nefiri ended up with her demonic appearance being accompanied by her pack of darkened doggies. But remember how earlier we talked about two other champions being alongside Taboo in the Harrowing Map's coffins? Well, one of these champions was a tree-like creature known as Gavid the Plant King, who we actually have some footage of. And from my research, Gavid is more frequently spelled without an I in his name, so we'll just go by that when talking about him. Even though at first Gavid seems like he would have been a clear example of inspiration for Zyra, it was actually confirmed after Zyra's release that her champion designers had no idea Gavid ever existed, meaning that this generic tree may have inspired Maokai's eventual release, but I don't know, that's of course just some speculation. As for his lore, Gavid was a tangle of vines and thorns who had grown up in a richly soiled area just outside of Demacia, where after watching the nearby Demacian residents chop his friends and family up to use for firewood, Gavid angrily sought revenge on these killers, as well as humans in general, since they stood in the way of the growth of his kind. Though once again Gavid was not at all an inspiration for Zyra, his kit did function a bit similarly, with his passive spawning a vine near him every 2 seconds that would damage melee attackers if they were struck, and his basic abilities each applied some form of boost to these vines. His Q turned one of these passively spawning vines into a thorn spitter that would damage nearby enemies, while his W would grow these vines into a massive entangling barbs that would root any enemies inside. However, where these abilities began to show some differences comes primarily in his E and R. His E could transform the affected vine into a plant that would heal allies every 3 seconds, while his R would root himself in place to heal for a large amount of his max HP, growing 7 vines around him that of course could be transformed with his other abilities, which even though this was a cool concept, especially considering that this was a champion created during League's beta phase, it was a bit too generic and out of place with the game's direction at the time, prompting the team to give Gavid the axe to focus on other areas. However, even though Gavid didn't directly inspire any champions on his own, if we want to take a look at another scrap champion whose creation provided the basis for not one but 2 other champions, we needn't look any further than Yvonne and his relationship with another unnamed character who was also being developed at the same time. You see, Yvonne was released publicly for the first time during PAX 2015 as an old champion idea, who, if you couldn't already guess, functioned very similarly to Ziggs. And even though we don't have his direct abilities, we do know that he was originally designed to be a control mage with Ziggs' current Q and W in combination with Xerath's long-range zoning. But unlike the other champions we've covered so far, Yvonne's story as a developed champion is a bit of a two-parter, as he was being made alongside an unnamed Yordle who carried an anchor and pretty much just ran around whacking people, with both of these champions each having their own problems that eventually served as the other's solution. As for Yvonne, they wanted to make an explosives expert who's a bit chaotic and springy. However, this was hard to do if he was going to wear heavy metal armor. And in the case of the Yordle, having such a goofy playstyle was fun, but it was too tricky to easily identify an anchor being used like a baseball bat. So they pretty much just took these 2 champions and swapped them around, resulting in Ziggs and Nautilus. Ziggs being a mad, chaotic Yordle with an absurdly shiny smile fit the bill much better for this zoning playstyle that they wanted to execute with Yvonne, whereas Nautilus took inspiration from many of Yvonne's initial armored concepts and used the anchor as a hooking tool, making the identities of both of these champions significantly more clear and cohesive. Now, to cap off the 3 champions that were all placed in the Harrowing Map's coffins, we have one more of League's original 40 clan champions, as well as his footage and abilities, with this character being essentially an abandoned smurf named Averdian the Astral Guardian, who was probably the closest to being released with his original abilities of anyone on this list, and man, a couple of these abilities were strong. Though Averdian's passive contains practically no direct information as to how it functions, his Q, Astral Beam, would fire out a beam of light that could not have its damage be prevented in any way, which, yeah, that sounds like it would have been a whole lot of fun to play against. His W, Detonate, fired out a pulse of energy that would slow enemies, kind of like how Vex does with her W. and his E Consume Spirit would absorb one of his passive spirits to boost his spell damage temporarily, as well as spawn a burning ring around him that would harm enemies for the same duration. And as for his ultimate Lockdown, once again we have a 5-second suppression that would deal damage to the enemy caught inside for each second of its duration, which I guess was just a thing that was more common for original champions to have in their kits back in the day. When it came time to deciding if a Verdian was worth further development or even potentially releasing, Riot Nocturne posted on League's community forums that he was strongly advocating for the champion's addition to the game's roster, even making his profile picture a Verdian's icon before eventually changing it back to Ravager Nocturne as a means of indicating this evil Megamind Smurf would no longer have plans to arrive onto the Rift. However, even though Averdian's cosmic knowledge ended up receiving a quite literal nail in the coffin, the exact opposite was the result of what is possibly League's most well-known unreleased champion, Shin, who today we're now familiar with as Aurelion Sol. Being teased for the first time in 2013, Riot got the community excited about a giant mythical storm dragon that would grace the Rift with his thunderous might, teasing a beast named Shin that was in development to truly fulfill a powerful dragon fantasy, and though things seemed promising at first, having made such an early announcement led to some problems. Firstly, Shin was still pretty early into his development, as there weren't any hard set abilities in his kit at the time, and Riot's design team wasn't even fully sure how they could execute on capturing the curling movement of a dragon in such a fast-paced game, while also making sure he didn't take up too much space on the screen. On top of that, one of Shin's main initial ideas is that a lot of his power budget was placed into being able to fly anywhere on the map with a toggled ability, which while very unique and very cool, fundamentally destroyed the strategy of Vision and didn't leave much room for other parts of his kit to shine, which at one point included a global ability like Briar's ult, where Shin would soar in a streak of lightning across the rift towards a champion hit by the ability's initial cast. After a couple of years had passed since the champion was initially teased, Riot finally announced the immense amount of changes that they had to make to transform Shin into a playable character, apologizing for promising a champion so early into its development and teasing the release of Aurelion Sol, who in fairness brought some of Shin's scrapped concepts into the game along with him. Though Asol's Storm Dragon skin and a line of TFT Little Legends are direct homages to this cancelled champion, Shin was a major lesson as to how Riot would handle their teasers moving forward, and marked one of the most well-known stories when it comes to the community rallying around a single champion. And though a 2.5-year development time is already quite a long period for any champion, this number is only half the amount of time it took for Riot to go through 2 entire champion concepts before finally coming to the Shuriman Emperor we know today as Azir, making 2 additional scrap champions in the process known as Soterios the Hydro Soul and Seth the Sand Mage. The story behind Soterios was that he was a self-proclaimed high priest that would drown fearful townsfolk as a means of using their unconscious corpse to perform resurrections once dragging their body back to land. However, after trying to do the same with his own body so that he could try and obtain his own divinity, the water's higher powers punished his selfishness by resurrecting his body as a Hydrosoul servant forced to only do their bidding. Being a water-based champion first developed during League's beta phase, had a pretty interesting set of abilities for the time, with his passive starting things off simply by granting nearby allies additional mana and his Q summoning some form of water elemental for his other abilities to use. His W Crushing Wave fired a damaging wave of water in a target direction that could have its range extended if it came into contact with a water elemental in the process, while his E essentially functioned like Anivia's ult does today by creating an area of slowness that would increase its power based on which direction you were traveling within the vortex. But where things get especially interesting is that his ultimate Torrent would create a global downpour that increased allies' health and mana regeneration, as well as boosting their spell damage for its duration, which even by today's standards is quite an impressive ability. Now, as you may have guessed, Soterio's design was initially scrapped due to it being just simply too hard to reliably code into the game at the time, but that didn't stop Riot's design team from trying to recreate this map-changing playstyle in a different way with Seth the Sand Mage just a couple of years later. Seth was a very fun and very unique champion who would try and spread as much sand as possible around the map with his various abilities, which included the significantly stronger Azir turret-like thing, as well as an ultimate that summoned these massive sand hands to force enemies into a small area while damaging them in the process. Any abilities that landed on champions who were standing on this spread of sand applied additional effects, sort of like Talia's worked ground, and at one point there was even a little sandworm nicknamed Lil Buddy who'd help in dealing this additional damage by biting enemies from these dunes. Though, like his predecessor, Seth's kit would eventually be reworked due to his visuals simply taking up far too much storage while also being a giant technical challenge, we did get ourselves Azir out of it, and while he wasn't the most bug-free champion himself, man, he is just one of the coolest and most unique champions in the game who can make some pretty insane plays. Once again, I super appreciate War Thunder for sponsoring this video, and if you haven't done so already, be sure to check out the links down below in either the description or in the pinned comment to get a free massive bonus pack of premium skins, the exclusive Eagle of Valor decoration, 100,000 silver lions, 7 days of premium accounts, and even more all for free on either PC or console if it'll be your first time playing or if you're a returning player from at least 6 months ago. Thanks again for sticking through the entirety of this video. I really do appreciate it, and if you haven't already, feel free to subscribe since, I don't know, you seem to like the video, I guess, so maybe you'd like more of my content. But yeah, with that all being said, hope you guys have a great rest of your day or night. As always, I'll catch you guys in the next video. Later!